Putin's empire. How one man reshaped Russia is not simply a story about a political leader or the mechanics of power. It is a grand emotional saga about a nation's search for direction, about wounds both visible and unseen, and about the consequences when one man's vision bends the arc of an entire country. In the late 20th century, Russia staggered through the chaos of a lost empire and shattered certainties. Hunger lines, rampant corruption, and a palpable sense of humiliation haunted every street corner, every home that had once felt the pride of Soviet might. Into this fissure walked Vladimir Putin, an unassuming, enigmatic figure hardened by the years spent in the shadows of the KGB. For Russians worn by uncertainty, his quiet confidence and chilling resolve promised stability and respect. Yet few could have foreseen how a single man, once a faceless bureaucrat, would in 2 fateful decades reshape the destiny of 145 million souls and cast the world order into tumultuous uncertainty. This book charts the story of how Putin forged himself from the crucible of hardship, traumas both personal and communal, and a relentless will to restore Russia's greatness. It is equally a tale of struggle and silence, of democratic hopes battered and bruised under the weight of state power, of oligarchs tamed and tithes exacted, of borders redrawn with iron and fire. But to see Putin's empire only through the lens of geopolitics or realpolitik is to miss the emotional currents that run beneath the Kremlin's marble halls. Putin's rise was the answer to a desperate yearning for dignity among millions who had lost faith in the future. His rule is both solace and torment, pride and pain, a balm for humiliation and a wellspring of new wounds. Through these pages, we travel with Russia, from St. Petersburg's windswept avenues where a young Putin first learned the language of survival, to the gilded facades of Moscow, where power concentrates like a storm. We meet the silenced and the silencer, the enriched and the exiled, the dreamers and the broken. Ultimately, we ask, what is the cost of a restored empire, and who is left to count the scars? This is the chronicle of an era, an empire reborn and remade, for better, for worse, by the will of one man. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life now. Let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. Shadows Rising in the East. In the dying light of the 20th century, Russia found itself wandering a nocturnal landscape of confusion and pain. What had once been the mighty Soviet Union melted into the shadows of memory, leaving behind the ghosts of certainty and the embers of pride. The air itself in Moscow and St. Petersburg seemed haunted, steeped in a sense of loss so deep it tinged the dawn sky with the gloom of regret. Each day was a negotiation with despair. The promises of perestroika unraveled into the reality of empty shelves and broken institutions. The ruble collapsed, savings evaporated, and the sacred order of generations was upended. Old pensioners wept in the cold as their life's work, their reason for enduring decades of hardship, was auctioned off to faceless oligarchs. The intelligentsia, once the proud conscience of the nation, muttered bitter jokes in poorly lit kitchens, uncertain whether their next words might draw the gaze of someone with an agenda. Yet as the world celebrated the so-called end of history, Russia began a very different chapter, one of identity lost, then fiercely sought again. The West looked on with a mixture of opportunism and pity, plundering Russia's riches under the guise of assistance and tutelage. But within the heart of the nation, the pain of humiliation began to ferment into something else, a hunger for stability, for respect, for resurrection. It is in these twilight years that the ghost of empire lingered most persistently, whispering from the halls of the Kremlin, threading through the wounded pride of the populace. Who would step forward to heal the wounds, to rally the lost, to reforge the bonds that once held the world's largest country together? The answer did not come from the charismatic reformers or the billionaire upstarts. It came from the gray margins of the bureaucracy, from an anonymous functionary who moved quietly as a shadow, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. In 1999, as bombs thundered in Chechnya and politicians bickered over crumbs, Putin emerged as prime minister. Thin, unsmiling, with eyes like chipped slate and a presence both slight and indomitable, he was a cipher to many. But in back rooms, behind heavy security doors, the deal was set. The faltering President Yeltsin, battered by illness and history alike, would retreat into his villa, and Putin would become the steward of Russia's battered destiny. His first words as acting president were sparse, but thunderous. "If you're in the toilet, we'll whack you in the toilet." Bleak poetry for a nation wearied by softness. Thunder for an empire desperate for strength. The rules changed overnight. Corruption was no less present, but curried a new master. The oligarchs were politely, then ruthlessly, returned to heel. Journalists, once the vanguard of democratic hope, began to disappear or flee. In the streets, for the first time in a decade, there was the faintest whiff of order frail perhaps, but better than ruin. Yet, who was this man who sought to heal? Russia with fire and fear? Was he a savior or a tyrant? Was this the first act of a genuine rebirth, or the opening notes of a tragedy yet unwritten? As the 21st century dawned, Vladimir Putin strode into the Kremlin, not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. The future would be written in his image, and the shadows that rose in the east would soon darken the world. Chapter 2. The Making of Putin. From Leningrad to the Kremlin. To understand Vladimir Putin, the man behind the myth, the architect of modern Russia, one must first descend into the crucible of his past. Born in 1952 in the battered city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Putin entered a world still scarred by the siege, the hunger, and the shattered families of World War II. His parents were survivors, both of war and a regime that had known few redemptions. Only cycles of fear and hope. As a skinny, scrappy boy roaming the communal courtyards. Young Volodya learned early that the world was a harsh place best faced with cold calculation. Survival demanded cunning, quick reflexes, and an ability to read intentions in the flicker of an eye. The city itself was a labyrinth of secrets, whispers, and betrayals, a living school for a future master of intrigue. Putin's path diverged sharply from his peers. Where others sought refuge in camaraderie or art, he sought power in discipline. The judo mat became his first arena of conquest, instilling in him not just physical resilience, but the vital lessons of leverage and control, of patient strategy. His mentors remarked on his relentless focus, his ability to remain calm even when the odds turned against him. In every contest, he recalled later, control is everything. This conviction would never leave him, drawn to the machinery of the state. Putin enrolled in Leningrad State University, where the thin boundaries between academia and surveillance blurred. It was here, in quiet rooms with drab curtains, that his real education began. The KGB recruited him directly upon graduation, sensing in the reserved young man both loyalty and ambition. For Putin, this was nothing short of a calling. Under the guidance of the Soviet security services, he learned to master invisibility, to navigate power, gather information, and strike without warning. His years with the KGB, first in Leningrad, then in Dresden, East Germany, transformed him. While the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of oblivion, Putin watched the machinery of empire decompose. In Dresden, he saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. He witnessed firsthand what it meant for a great power to unravel, and for its agents to become suddenly obsolete. One fateful night, as protesters threatened to torch the KGB compound, Putin called Moscow for instructions. None came. The silence was profound, and its lesson permanent. When the center cannot hold, you survive by your cunning. That moment in the silence of Dresden imprinted itself onto his soul. Putin would never again put his faith in unreliable masters. If Russia were to survive, it would have to be strong, and if he ever held power, he would never allow such chaos to take root again. Returning to a country in ruins, Putin entered local politics in St. Petersburg, working under reformist mayor Anatoly Sobchak. Behind his impassive manner, Putin proved an adept operator, mastering the art of loyalty up, control down. Relationships forged in these years would later serve as the backbone of his private power structure. Moscow soon beckoned. As Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, floundered, suffering health crises and repeated humiliation, a desperate Kremlin began searching for new blood, someone loyal, disciplined, invisible enough to manage the levers of state without threatening its fragile consensus. Thus, Putin was summoned to Moscow, cycling through the security apparatus until, by 1998, he was appointed head of the FSB, the KGB's successor. His rise was swift, quiet, and nearly unseen, the whisper before the storm. For Russians, few could guess the dimensions of the man now poised as heir apparent. He was colorless to many, but for those who paid attention, the warning signs were there. Absolute loyalty to the state, a preference for secrecy, a cold dismissal of sentimentality. By December 31st, 1999, as Yeltsin faded into history, Putin stepped onto the stage, promising not revolution, but restoration. The stage was set, a leader crafted by trauma, honed by secrecy, bound by a single consuming mission, to never let Russia fall again. He strode into the Kremlin alone, bearing the weight of a wounded nation, determined to reshape its destiny in his unforgiving image. Chapter 3. The Return of Strong Leadership. When Vladimir Putin assumed the reins of power at the dawn of the new millennium, Russia was suspended between hope and exhaustion. The country had been battered by a decade of failed reforms, mafia violence, and the bitter aftertaste of lost superpower status. Into this void, Putin injected a new creed, one forged of strength, order, and restoration. From the very first moments of his presidency, Putin exuded an aura that was both comforting and chilling. He was a father to the nation, but one whose love came with conditions. Gone were the days of drunken speeches and rudderless days under Yeltsin. Instead, Russia awoke to a leader who worked tirelessly, who demanded discipline, and who offered in return, if not joy, then at least predictability. Putin's first great challenge was the Second Chechen War. Where Yeltsin had faltered, Putin delivered. His approach was brutal. The city of Grozny was reduced to ruins, the Chechen resistance crushed with unrelenting military force. To the rest of the world, it was a display of state terror. But in Russia, it read as a signal that chaos would no longer be tolerated. Nationalist fervor, once dormant, was suddenly ablaze. The wounds of the 1990s, it seemed, could be cauterized with strength. Those early years were marked by the systematic reassertion of the Kremlin's control. Regional governors, long accustomed to acting as little kings, were brought to heel. Through a combination of legal reforms and sheer intimidation, oligarchs who had made billions looting state assets were given a stark choice: align with the new order or face ruin. The most defiant, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, were swiftly neutralized, wealth confiscated, power erased, exiles issued with chilling efficiency. But Putin's genius lay not only in his ruthlessness. He was a master at harnessing the emotional hunger of the Russian people. He knew the language of their wounds. He spoke of lost greatness, of betrayal by the West, of the sacred necessity to recover pride. In every speech, every photo op astride horses or descending into icy depths, Putin embodied the archetype of the strong, Impassive Tsar, a living antidote to the chaos of democracy. The media, so vibrant in the previous decade, became another casualty. Independent voices were swiftly silenced or bought out. State-controlled channels broadcast heroic narratives of the new Russia, and the image was clear. Order has been restored. The old humiliations are over. For millions, this was enough. They rallied behind their leader, confused by the world's criticisms, but comforted by the sense of stability that finally returned. Internationally, Putin's Russia ceased to be a passive observer. He reminded the world, sometimes with chilling bluntness, that Russia's interests were not to be trifled with. Energy politics became a weapon. Ukraine and Europe learned the hard way that Russian gas was not simply a commodity, but a tool of influence, both at home and abroad. The message was unambiguous. Russia was back. There was a new order, and behind it stood a single man, unbending and relentless. The cost in freedom, in lives, in possibility, was immense. But for many Russians, it was a price worth paying for the restoration of dignity, for the feeling, however fleeting, that Russia stood tall again. The age of strong leadership had returned, and in its iron grip, the transformation of Russia gathered pace, reshaping the nation's soul in the likeness of its enigmatic ruler. Chapter 4. The Silencing of Dissent. Under Putin, silence became a form of statecraft. The Kremlin's corridors, once home to cacophonous debate and midnight crises, gradually grew still. Only a narrow bandwidth of voices could survive. The rest were silenced, exiled, or worse. This was not the sudden night of terror remembered from Stalin's purges, but the slow, methodical quieting of a country's imagination. Not at first, dissent appeared to survive. Early in Putin's rule, Russians still gathered in squares to protest, and independent radio hosts dared to challenge the official line. But the old idealism of the 1990s was no match for the new methods of control. Legislation, lawsuits, and threats replaced midnight arrests. Newspapers folded under financial pressure. Critical editors found themselves facing invented tax charges or unexplained accidents. The turning point came with the fate of NTV, Russia's last remaining independent television channel. In a display of chilling efficiency, Kremlin-friendly business interests orchestrated a takeover. Anchors who spoke truth to power found themselves replaced overnight, the national conversation narrowing into a chorus of cheerful conformity. But it was not just the oligarchs and journalists who learned to fear. Activists, artists, and opposition politicians, the colorful patchwork of Russian civil society, became targets. The language of state TV turned ominous. Protesters were foreign agents. Idealists were traitors. The machinery ground forward. Human rights organizations faced raids. Their leaders surveilled and smeared. The air in Russia grew thick with the unspoken understanding that, too, much honesty could be deadly. This new culture of fear was both visible and invisible, a dread that suffused daily life. Friends stopped speaking politics over dinner. Neighbors watched cautiously. What had once been a cacophonous, boisterous nation grew quiet, deferential. Putin's face became omnipresent, his approval ratings a barometer not just of popularity, but of survival. Yet, dissent did not disappear entirely. Figures like Boris Nemtsov risked everything, standing defiantly before the walls of riot police. The punk rockers of Pussy Riot stormed cathedrals with hope as reckless as it was brave. Their courage, and in some cases, their blood carved scars into the smooth marble of the regime. Reprisals were swift and merciless. Nemtsov was gunned down near the Kremlin. Anna Politkovskaya murdered in her stairwell. Western observers sometimes mocked the passivity of ordinary Russians, but they misunderstood the cost of courage in Putin's Russia. To dissent was to risk home, friends, and freedom. In cafes and kitchens, the language of irony and parable made a quiet comeback, as in Soviet days. The price of speaking out was measured in exile, poverty, or the ultimate silence. With every fallen protester and shuttered publication, the myth of an unassailable empire grew. The world saw a country united, disciplined, and untroubled by the mess of freedom. But beneath the marble and steel, cracks widened in the foundation. The cost of silencing was not just paid in lives, but in something even more precious: the possibility of imagining a different Russia, one where the future belonged to all its people. Chapter 5: Power, Wealth, and the Oligarchs. The dawn of Putin's empire brought with it not only a new style of governance, but a radical reshaping of the relationship between money and power. In the anarchic days of the 1990s, a cadre of oligarchs had risen, their fortunes built on the carcass of the Soviet economy. They were untouchable, more powerful than ministers, brokers of fate whose only true loyalty was to themselves. Putin, with his unerring instinct for control, understood that no true sovereignty was possible as long as these titans ruled unchecked. His approach was not to destroy the oligarchy, but to tame it. Within months of taking office, he assembled Russia's richest men and presented a simple, brutal contract: stay out of politics or be destroyed. The message was clear. Some, like Roman Abramovich, quickly grasped the new reality and adapted, channeling money into state projects, football clubs, and charitable causes. Others, intoxicated by past impunity, underestimated the resolve of the new order. The fall of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, was a lesson written in steel and fire, a televised arrest, a show trial, a decade in Siberian penal colonies. With the oligarchs neutered, Putin's inner circle, the Siloviki, men from the security services, filled the vacuum. These were his true allies, bound not just by mutual interest, but by shared memory, loyalty, and a kind of martial brotherhood. Under their stewardship, state-owned giants like Gazprom and Rosneft swelled in power, becoming instruments of both domestic control and international leverage. Wealth flowed, but it was no longer anarchic. Political reliability, rather than entrepreneurial daring, determined privilege. Corruption did not vanish. It was reorganized, disciplined. The economy saw periods of genuine growth. Russian cities flashed with new construction, and a middle class emerged, blinking into the light. Yet always, there was a sense of fragility. The price of prosperity was subservience. The Kremlin's managed capitalism was a paradox, dynamic enough to enrich a chosen few, restrictive enough to keep them on a short leash. Lavish palaces rose along Black Sea cliffs. Yachts sparkled in Mediterranean harbors. But all such splendor came with a shadow. At any moment, fortune could turn. Exile or imprisonment awaited those whose ambitions dared to outshine the leaders. For ordinary Russians, this concentration of wealth and power was both intoxicating and embittering. There was pride in national champions, in the new steel and glass that dotted Moscow's skyline. But there was also a gnawing awareness that the riches were not for all, that beneath the facade, the old inequalities had found new forms. As Putin consolidated his empire, the oligarchs became both symbol and tool, proof to the world that Russia could be rich, but also a warning that those riches belonged first and foremost to the state, to the dream of restoration, and always, ultimately, to one man. Chapter 6: Russia Reborn: Nationalism and Identity. The resurrection of Russia under Putin went beyond politics and economics. It was a rebirth of national myth, a reacquaintance with old glories and ancient wounds. For centuries, Russians had defined themselves by their suffering, their endurance, their capacity for sacrifice. Under Putin, these threads were woven into a new tapestry of national pride. In the schools, Textbooks were rewritten. The chaos of the 1990s was painted as a nightmare. The Soviet Union's legacy scrubbed clean of its darkest stains. Instead, emphasis was placed on victory in war, in space, in culture. Putin appeared at commemorations dressed as both head of state and shepherd of memory, his presence anchoring the nation to a narrative of eternal struggle and triumph. Religion, dismissed for decades by communist dogma, returned as a cornerstone of identity. The Russian Orthodox Church, once persecuted, now flourishes, its priests blessing missiles and sharing the stage with generals. Faith and nationhood became inseparable. Patriotic songs were played at every turn. The language of sacrifice and destiny filled the airwaves. Putin's vision of Russian identity was not merely nostalgic, it was defensive, sometimes aggressive. The West was cast as both rival and corrupter, its values incompatible with the Russian soul. This framing resonated deeply, especially as NATO's frontiers crept ever closer. The humiliation of past defeats was transformed into fuel for a new assertiveness, a conviction that Russia's spiritual integrity must be protected at all costs. State-run. Youth movements, like Nashi, swelled in numbers, their rallies awash in flags and slogans. Monuments to Soviet heroes, once neglected, were restored. Even Stalin, the architect of countless tragedies, was reimagined less as a butcher and more as a stern guardian of greatness. In this landscape, there was both comfort and peril. Russians once again believed in themselves, in the possibility of something greater than mere survival. Yet such pride came with an edge, suspicion of difference, hostility to dissent, a readiness to see external or internal enemies everywhere. Xenophobia rose, and minorities often became the scapegoats for national anxieties. Identity in Putin's Russia was not passive. It was a call to arms, an emotional drumbeat demanding allegiance, promising purpose. For many, it was a salvation from the chaos of meaninglessness. For others, it was a prison dot as the years passed. This sense of mission became the engine of everything, from cultural revival to foreign policy adventures. Russia's soul, so long battered and confused, now marched in lockstep behind its leader, and the drums of history pounded ever louder. Chapter 7. Beyond the Borders. Crimea, Syria, and the global stage. The Russian tricolor fluttered over Crimea in March 2014, but the ripples extended far beyond the Black Sea Peninsula. For Vladimir Putin, borders are not mere lines on a map. They are the scars and hopes of a wounded empire, raw reminders of past humiliations and future ambitions. In reclaiming Crimea, Putin secured not just a slice of land, but a crucial part of Russia's historical identity. The move was bold, almost reckless, executed with precision and an audacity that left the world gasping. The annexation was a masterstroke of hybrid warfare. Soldiers with masked faces and no insignia, little green men, appeared overnight, taking over airports, government buildings, and broadcast stations. The world's response wavered between outrage and incredulity. Debates raged in distant capitals, but on the streets of Simferopol, a new reality crystallized in a matter of days. Overnight, the global order trembled as Western leaders scrambled, belatedly imposing sanctions, and Ukraine braced for what felt like a dismemberment. For the Russian people, Crimea was more than a strategic prize. It was the ultimate assertion of agency. Television screens beamed images of jubilant crowds, Russian flags waving in the seized peninsula squares, and for a fleeting moment, Vladimir Putin became the embodiment of a long-awaited triumph. But glory is a double-edged sword. What started as a display of national unity soon morphed into a standoff with the West. The Iron Curtain, it seemed, had been replaced with new barricades, sanctions, accusations, and the ominous buildup of NATO on Russia's doorstep. Yet, borders for Putin are also lines to be blurred, not just redrawn. In Syria, the distant Middle Eastern conflict became another arena for resurrection, a place where the Russian bear could roar once more on the global stage. Russian jets thundered over Aleppo, and the Kremlin's alliance with Bashar al-Assad transformed Moscow into a kingmaker. Bombs fell, rebel strongholds buckled, and the world watched as Russia's military prowess, dormant for decades, became the arbiter of a brutal civil war. The United States was forced to negotiate. The world was forced to acknowledge. But as Russian power radiated outward, the cost grew heavy. The world saw Russia not as a friend, but a fearsome adversary. International sanctions squeezed the economy. Isolation pushed innovation underground, and the average citizen shouldered invisible burdens, lost jobs, rising prices, and a sense of embattled siege. Through all this, Putin's message remained unwavering. Russia is back, stronger than ever, and its future will not be dictated by foreign hands. Crimea and Syria stand as twin symbols of Putin's vision. A Russia that asserts itself without apology, that seeks respect where once there was derision. But beneath the surface, uncertainty simmers. Each move on this grand chessboard extracts a toll: the cost of defiance, the consequences of glory, and the question that haunts every superpower: what comes after the standing ovation, when the curtain falls and the spotlight shifts elsewhere? Chapter 8: Legacy and Ruins. The Price of the Empire. Time is the final judge of every empire, every leader. For Vladimir Putin, the reckoning is as inevitable as the Russian winter: slow, implacable, and merciless. The legacy he sought to forge, so grand in its ambitions, glitters with the seductive illusions of power, yet casts immense shadows on the everyday lives of millions. The empire Putin rebuilt stands taller than ever in the eyes of its supporters. Crimea is home. The Russian military commands respect, and the nation moves with the confidence of an actor finally given its role in history's great drama. The pride restored is palpable, echoing from Red Square to the smallest provincial town. But as is so often the case with power, the ruins are never far from the foundations. Within Russia, the price is measured in silenced voices and lost dreams. Dissenters vanish into the churning gears of state machinery, journalists lose their freedom or their lives, and the young dream of departure rather than destiny. The economy lurches through cycles of boom and bust, increasingly insulated from global capital, yet dependent on the unsustainable export of its natural resources. Oligarchs flourish as the chosen, while ordinary Russians navigate a reality of shrinking opportunities and swelling nostalgia. Outside its borders, the empire's reach comes at a cost, too. Sanctions have walled off innovation, bred resentment, and tarnished reputations. Once cordial neighbors eye Russia with suspicion. Alliances have hardened, and new lines, digital, political, even moral, divide the world once more. Yet, perhaps, the most profound ruins are those etched in the Russian psyche. Putin's era is a time when fear and pride are inextricably bound, when citizens are asked to carry the burden of history while celebrating fleeting victories. The trauma of the past, never fully addressed, has been channeled into the creation of legend and myth, yet the wounds remain, visible in everyday anxieties and worn faces. As the years pass, the question grows more urgent. What is the true price of Putin's empire? For every statue erected, another is torn down in secret. For every triumph broadcast in dazzling color, there is a story left untold, a voice unheard, a destiny denied. Yet history is not finished with Vladimir Putin, nor with Russia. Empires rise and fall, but their echoes endure. This, then, is the true mark of legacy, not the monuments or the parades, but the beating, suffering, yearning heart of a nation forever changed. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now, let's begin. Enjoy.